Hi, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my understanding of the current state of diversity in teams, a brief introduction to cultural boundaries, leadership and management of teams, and conflict resolution between group cultures. Research has been observing an increase in the number of women and ethnic minorities entering the workplace. They've also observed an increasing age and generational disparities over time. The past few decades have been marked by a drive to understand and support the increase in racial, ethnic, gender, and generational diversity in the workplace. Popular political activist movements like the gender and cultural studies disciplines in universities and some publications have been operating with an underlying claim that the demographic identity is paramount over the individual. They make the case that as gender and racial parity are achieved at the top of structures of authority, that organizations will significantly improve their financial performance. A recent study released in January of 2018 by Hunt at McKinsey produced a report showing direct correlation and a proposed causal link between very large financial performance gains and gender and race diversity at an executive level. Walker and Scott lay out a gendered approach to historical analysis based on the postmodern deconstructionist work by French philosopher Jacques Derrida and the power dynamics work by Michel Foucault. As an example of the broad reach of this movement, in 2015, the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau selected a ministerial cabinet predicated not specifically on competence, but on achieving a demographic representation of the Canadian population and gender equity at all costs. It's useful now more than ever to understand the axioms that predicate the political movement and to know the existing literature on team performance and group behavior as various forms, levels, and descriptors of diversity are used in common parlance. If the political claims hold true, we'd expect to repeatedly see a covariant effect between the demographic diversity and performance. First, we need to parse the term diversity into categories that can help us differentiate the facets of the idea. There are various ways to do this, some more functional than others, depending on what you want to do and what you want to analyze. Levi details 3 facet categories that can get us started: organizational diversity, demographic diversity, and psychological diversity. These terms are functionally distinct, but they still maintain some correlation with each other under a variety of circumstances. Organizational or hierarchical diversity is a form of diversity typically observable through publications or artifacts from an organization representing a hierarchy of status, rank, function, or tenure. Demographic diversity is the form of diversity that's most spoken about, in part because it's the most readily identifiable through socialization. These categories are socially useful, but they're mostly immutable characteristics like age and sex, race, and place of birth. Psychological diversity is not commonly discussed. I think conceptually it's likely the most difficult to intuit and observe. Psychological diversity is only partially observable through relatively recently developed long-form psychometric testing and interview. These are the characterological dispositions of a person's expressed personality, usually under nominal emotional states. These traits can vary significantly during adolescence and tend to stabilize around the late 20s and early 30s. The high-level summary of the research suggests that psychological diversity is the one that produces the largest positive effect sizes in work team performance. It's also reported that demographic diversity tends to be a fairly weak proxy for this psychological diversity. Cultural boundaries are conceptual simplifications that allow us to draw lines following similar cultural characteristics. These simplified categorizations help us make certain assumptions about the social groups we operate in, so we can determine how we act with less cognitive load. At times, these assumptions can be very wrong and get us into trouble, but these simplifications are very useful and necessary. Identifying commonality with other people allows us to extend trust to others in the form of a series of axiomatic presuppositions that underscore interactions with them. As a cultural boundary at an individual or group level, this might look like peer association with similar temperaments, political views, family ties, or anything that might indicate to us that the other person might subscribe to similar beliefs or rituals or hold a sense of shared fate. The levels of complexity of in-group assumptions can extend to abstractions outside of the group itself. For example, how an in-group relates to specific groups or other people or organizations or other nations. The idea of organizational cultural boundaries may refer to relationships to authority within an organization or group, but also on how an organization might interact with another organization that it's doing business with. At a national level, this could look like a stance on immigration or foreign policy. At a global level, the concept would probably look something like an underlying philosophical underpinning or a sense of global ethics. Assessing all of these relationships at first meeting is basically impossible, and sometimes it's never even discussed in close friendships. Some of these axioms are just assumed intuitively based on a few small proxy indicators, even surface demographic information. And as long as a conflicting situation doesn't present itself, there's likely little reason to awkwardly examine the massive extent of assumptions that we're making about each other all the time. Global work teams come with a set of cultural challenges that need to be contended with to foster productive team interactions and navigate interpersonal conflict. It's useful to understand the competencies that might get us through this. On the leadership side of the competencies, paying attention to the motivational dispositions of the individuals on the team and guiding the right form of socialization and cultural hybridization encompass some of what I'd consider to be the most challenging aspects of team development. On the management side, clearly and likely repeatedly articulating tasks, roles, and responsibility, reducing overhead administrative distractions, and negotiating performance evaluation up front are likely all aspects of necessary management competencies. In the effort of hybrid culture formation, maintenance, and team socialization, leaders need to show competence in striking the right balance between, as Levi suggests, promoting a sense of similarity among team members to encourage a common social identity, or alternatively, to view the team as an amalgam of unique individuals to foster personal identities. This effort is continuous, and while most leaders will only manage this up front, the process needs to take place throughout the entirety of the project or program to ensure its success. Ultimately, the hybrid culture should produce a narrative structure describing how one should act and a set of expectations for the operation of the team. The conflict resolution literature divides strategies roughly into three categories: solution orientation, non-confrontation, and control or domination. Some of the literature further divides the solution orientation category into a variety of approaches, the two primary being distributive and integrative solutions. While the details vary, the literature strongly suggests that the preferred conflict resolution strategy for long-term solutions across culture is integrative. Each hybrid team culture that has a preferred method of conflict resolution based on the characteristics of that culture. The literature suggests that groups supporting substantive conflict are correlated positively with positive outcomes. Hofstede uses a series of dimensions to describe national cultures, the first four of which were part of his original IBM study in 1970 and have accumulated the most data. These dimensions were extracted through a brute force statistical multivariate factor analysis rather than a more business-friendly but relatively statistically unsupported approach like that of Trompenaars and Meyer. Worth mentioning is the fact that while cultural dimensions are treated as independent, there's still some covariance between them. In other words, the dimensions are not entirely separate and independent sentiments at all levels of analysis. There is a literature base discussing conflict resolution strategies and individual personality. So Hofstede from the culture side and McCrae from the personality side attempted to correlate their findings and demonstrated psychometrically significant covariance between the two constructs. The two researchers had some significant differences of opinion in their interpretations and their predictions as to causality, but regardless, the findings are still useful. Levi talks about challenges related to transnational teams. And using Hofstede's language, Levi suggests that the two main cultural dimensions that affect teams are the individualism versus collectivism dimension and power distance. Power distance from a Big Five personality perspective co-varies negatively with openness to experience and extroversion, and positively with conscientiousness. Individualism co-varies positively with just extroversion. So if we use the personality correlations as proxy for hybrid cultural description, we can correlate a series of cultural characteristics that would most positively correlate with integrative conflict solutions. So this theoretical hybrid culture would look something like high individualism, moderate power distance, high masculinity, and low uncertainty avoidance. So if we sort through Hosfield's data, we find that this hybrid culture pattern actually bears significant resemblance to the cultural baseline in English-speaking countries, so that's the US, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, UK, and Ireland, and also India and Switzerland. The idea of perspective taking is also positively correlated to conflict resolution success. So also positively correlated with this personality trait openness, and by extension, primarily high masculine cultures with low power distance. What this implies is that the generation of a hybrid culture is likely easier for a leader to train the more masculine and low power distance culture to bridge the gap to the high power distance culture rather than the other way around. These findings could guide a leader's aim as to how to socialize their team in the initial stages of hybrid culture development. So in summary, the term diversity is diluted and needs an update in common parlance. Psychological diversity yields positive result in creative endeavors. Demographic diversity is a poor proxy for achieving tailored psychological diversity. Cultural boundaries and social generalization are necessary for social cognitive functioning, but can be wrong and can yield unwanted antisocial behaviors. Leaders and managers need to be deliberate in their team development efforts. Understanding cultural and psychological predispositions can help. Integrative conflict resolution strategies are associated with positive outcomes, and these strategies are tied to cultural dispositions and personality.